We all admit that no one's perfect. We all admit that. We can preach it. We say it to one another. No one's perfect. However, knowing it on a mental note and believing it are two different things. When you and I as Christians, or as humans, I should just say, when we come face to face with human weakness or sin, imperfection, making a mistake, committing a big sin, there's usually a couple of responses. Whether we see it in other people or when we look at it in ourselves, we usually respond in a couple different ways. When we see human weakness in ourselves and in other people, oftentimes we can turn to judgment, anger, gossip, blame. We can be really, really harsh with other people and even with ourselves. Sometimes we go to the other extreme. So as to not face our human weakness, what we'll do is we'll stay in denial and we'll blame other people for our human weakness. And we don't even realize that we're doing that, by the way. It's our defense mechanism so that we don't have to face our human weakness. It's a defense mechanism without us even realizing. It's almost built into us that somehow, some way, because I'm feeling attacked right now, I'm going to somehow make you the problem. And we do that. That's actually what you call gaslighting. Why do we do these two things? These two extremes, these two responses? It's because we are afraid of imperfection. We are afraid of seeing sin. We are afraid of seeing human weakness and imperfection because somehow, some way, we have been taught that we have to be perfect. That you can't make mistakes. That you always have to do everything right. And if you don't, then you're not good. You're no longer good. You're a throwaway. Get rid of you. You no longer belong. Don't get me wrong. St. Paul talks about today, we have to judge behaviors. As Christians, we have the right to say this is wrong and this is right. However, we do not have the right to look at a person's weakness or sins, or myself, looking at my own sins and my own weakness and defining somebody by it. What does it mean to define somebody by their sin? It means to say that this is all there is to this person. This person has nothing else to them but this weakness that they have committed. That's it. And because of that, get rid of them. That's defining somebody by their weakness. And so as to not be defined by our weakness, so as to not have to say that because I've done this, I am this now, what we do is we either stay in denial or we go into deep self-hatred or discouragement. Or we discourage other people with our words and with our gossip and with our judgment. What we don't realize is that everybody has a story. Every one of us has a story. You may not know your own story yet. The older you get, and my older people here, you can probably testify to this, that the older you get, the more you actually look back on your life to understand why and how you operate the way that you do today. The older you get, the more you start making connections with your childhood. Let's look at the woman in the gospel today. It says that she's a sinner. When the gospel talks about a woman being a sinner, what it's talking about is that she was very lustful and promiscuous. So she had been with a plethora of people. Look at how Simon the Pharisee sees this woman's weakness, so as to not have to face his own human weakness. And by the way, the Pharisees were notorious at that time for preaching something and having a secret life. Preaching about doing God's will and being holy, but they themselves were stealing. They themselves were doing sinful things in secret. So as to not face his own weakness, he judges this woman. And he defines her by her sin. Do you see what kind of woman this is, he's saying in his head? What kind of woman? He's already classified her. What kind she is. Now she is her sin. This is what she is. This defining does not allow him to see that this woman has a story. Why would a woman give up her dignity and her worth to give up her body for money? Is it because she's just a throwaway, because that's just what she is? That to me is being very ignorant. If we look at people only on the surface and only on the outside, and we just label them based on their behaviors, that's very, very, very ignorant. The older you get, the more wisdom you have, the more you're able to see beyond the surface and to be able to understand that this person is doing what they're doing for a reason. I can give 1,000 different reasons as to why a woman would later on in her life give up her body for money. Poor self-esteem, no self-worth, hatred of herself. Where would all of those things come from? You all know this, by the way. You all know this stuff. Why would a woman have such low self-worth and low self-esteem and self-hatred and self-disgust? Why would she have all of those things? Where would she get all of those things from? How does a person grow up to having such low self-esteem? Where does that come from? Can somebody tell me? Thank you. Your home, your parents, your childhood. And this is not to blame mom and dad, because mom and dad are imperfect as well. So what happens is mom and dad's imperfections get projected onto the kids' imperfections, and this becomes a snowball effect. This is the human condition, unfortunately. But we have to look at the human condition to understand that people's compulsive behavior, my compulsive behavior, there's a story behind it. There's a reason why I'm doing what I'm doing today. There is a reason why I'm struggling with the sin that I'm struggling with today. It's not just stop doing that behavior. Fix it. You know better. How many times have you told yourself, stop doing that? And the next day you do it 10 times over. Why? Because you don't know your story yet. You have not been able to look at your story because you're too afraid of looking at your story. Because you're afraid of what might happen if you have to look at your human weakness. You're afraid that you're not going to be loved anymore, that somehow, some way, you're going to be a throwaway. But looking at your human story, looking at your own weakness, and knowing why you do what you are doing today, does not excuse your behavior and say that somehow, some way, what you're doing is okay now. Of course not. We're not going to say that because this woman probably has a dad wound and a mom wound, and that she probably had a terrible childhood, and she was probably abandoned and rejected and made fun of and bullied and maybe even sexually abused, that somehow, some way, it's okay for her to go and do the sins that she's doing. Absolutely not. But Jesus knows her story and decides not to judge her for what she's doing. And he says, because, look at the difference here of her and Simon the Pharisee. He makes the distinction right here. They both are sinners. They are both imperfect. But this woman faces sin and imperfection in herself first. And where does it lead her? It doesn't lead her to judge Simon the Pharisee. It doesn't lead her to look at everybody else. It leads her to look at herself. And when she looks at herself, it leads her to Jesus. That's the difference. Looking at her human weakness led her to realize how much she needed Jesus. It made her vulnerable. It made her weak. It made her fall at his feet and say, I am imperfect. I am broken, and I need you. But you and I today, oftentimes, we don't want to go there. We don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to face human weakness. We don't want to face our imperfections. We just kind of beat ourselves up. I'll give you an example. Just today, just right now, I did a small wrong move in the Mass. Technically, you're not supposed to sit down until after or during the Qadisha Alaha. For some reason, I don't know, maybe I'm not awake yet, okay? I walked over too early. And I wanted to start going into, why did you just do that? What's wrong with you? And I wanted to beat myself up for that tiny little movement. And then I said, who cares? It doesn't really actually matter. How we respond to our own imperfections and the imperfections of other people is how much we really know Jesus. That really tells you how much you really know Jesus. Because Jesus does not respond the way that we do. Jesus is not horrified, he is not ashamed, and he is not scandalized by our human weaknesses or by our stories, because we all have one. And your story is beautiful and it's holy, no matter how painful or ugly it might be. To Jesus, it's sacred. And he takes it all into consideration when he looks at us. And he loves every single part of us. And he doesn't condemn parts of us. He doesn't just love one part of you. He loves all of you. And he wants you to be able to stop condemning yourself and other people, because the more you can love and accept yourself, not for being perfect and doing everything wrong, actually for loving and accepting yourself for doing everything wrong, the more you're going to be able to do that to other people. But it begins with you. It begins with allowing Jesus to love you in your weakness, and then you to love yourself in your weakness. You to accept yourself in your weakness and not condemn yourself and not beat yourself up. It's a big challenge. Because guess who's your worst enemy? Yourself. It's your worst enemy. But if you being your worst enemy can now be your advocate to lead you to Jesus, you're going to begin to really see change in your behavior. And so what Jesus is looking for is what this woman did. So beautiful. Jesus says, she has, for those who have been forgiven little, love little. But because she has been forgiven so much, she was able to love more. So our human weaknesses and our sins only make us more capable of loving Jesus. If you lead yourself that way, if you accept yourself to go that way. Your human weakness and your sin does not make you disqualified, it makes you more qualified, is what Jesus is saying here. And so, today, whatever it is that you feel like you're struggling with, a compulsive behavior, a behavior that you want to stop, that you cannot stop, and every time you tell yourself to stop, you don't. Instead of telling yourself to stop that behavior, you need to stop and ask yourself, instead of being Simon the Pharisee to yourself or to other people, you need to stop and ask yourself, but why are you doing what you're doing? What are you looking for when you do what you're doing? What are you trying to fulfill in yourself when you go to the anxiety and screaming at other people, or the drugs, or the pornography, or the excessive buying of material things, or the depression, or the trying to control everybody around you? All of that compulsivity that you're doing, all of that compulsivity is being charged by something. Something that you have not faced yet. Something that you are too afraid of looking at. Look at it with Jesus. Don't be afraid of your story. look at it with love and mercy with Jesus. Because that's how Jesus looks at every single one of us, with love and with mercy. And he feels compassion for our human pain and our weakness and our sin, not condemnation. Today, begin with love and mercy towards yourself, with Jesus, and you will be able to give it to other people. Amen.